Neurodevelopmental disorders are a group of conditions with an onset during the period of biological development, before the brain fully reaches maturation. Many of these disorders are evident very early in development, oftentimes before a child begins grade school. The disorders vary in both the manifest symptoms and their treatment, but all are characterized by deficits that lead to impairments of personal, social, academic, or occupational functioning. Deficits range from very specific limitations of learning to more global deficits in social skills or intelligence. The neurodevelopmental disorders frequently co-occur. For example, it's not uncommon for an individual with autism spectrum disorder to also have intellectual disability. And many children with ADHD also have a specific learning disorder. The term intellectual disability replaces the older term mental retardation and aligns the language used in the DSM with federal law, education, and research. Intellectual disability is characterized by deficits in cognitive abilities such as learning, reasoning, problem-solving, abstract thinking, and planning. These deficits lead to impairments in school, social interactions, self-care, and independent living. Before we go into any more detail about intellectual disability, it is instructive to briefly discuss what intelligence is and how it's measured. Intelligence is an elusive concept, but it is usually defined as a mental quality that includes the ability to learn from experience, to solve problems, and to use acquired knowledge to adapt to novel situations. Of course, any definition of intelligence varies from culture to culture. People use the term intelligence to describe qualities that are valued because they enable success in their own time and culture. In highly developed industrialized nations like the United States, we value linguistic, logical, mathematical, and spatial abilities and use standardized tests of intelligence like the Stanford-Binet scale to measure them. Thus, intelligence is defined as a score on a test. In this slide, we can see that the average, or the score that most people get, that falls in the middle of the distribution, is 100. You can see that about 68% of people score within 15 points of the average or the median, and 96% score plus or minus 30 points of the average. A diagnosis of intellectual disability is warranted only for those individuals who score below 70 or below on standardized intelligence tests. It's important to remember that intellectual abilities fall along a continuum and that IQ scores are just one approximation of intellectual functioning. Because of this, clinical judgment is really very important in the accurate interpretation of an IQ score. For example, someone with an IQ score above 70 may have such severe adaptive problems in social judgment and social understanding that the person's real-life functioning is comparable to that of another person with an IQ below 70. A diagnosis of intellectual disability requires all three of the criteria illustrated in this slide. Deficits in intellectual functions, which we have already discussed, are just one of the three. In addition, an individual must also exhibit deficits in adaptive functions, which refer to how well the person meets standards of personal independence and social responsibility compared to others of similar age and sociocultural background. Deficits in adaptive functioning include things like the ability to remember, to read, to use language, to use and understand symbolic communication, to form social relationships, and to be able to take care of oneself. Thus, an individual must exhibit a deficit in at least one of three domains of adaptive functioning: academic, social, or practical, to meet criterion B of the DSM. Lastly, the onset of both intellectual and adaptive deficits must occur during the developmental period. The severity of intellectual disability can range from mild to profound, and is defined on the basis of adaptive functioning and not IQ. This is because adaptive functioning determines the amount of support that the individual requires. For example, mild intellectual disability accounts for about 85% of all cases of the disorder. With extended support, such individuals may achieve independence in some areas, but a subnormal intelligence leads to deficits in academic achievement and immature social relationships. With perseverance, those with a mild intellectual disability may function academically at about the level of a sixth grader, and as adults can acquire simple vocational skills. In contrast, those with profound intellectual disability will require total care throughout their lifetime. Such individuals, who make up about 1.5% of those diagnosed with intellectual disability, oftentimes have other severe physical and sensory motor dysfunctions that reduce their ability to negotiate their environment and deal with the demands of daily living. There are a number of factors that can alter the course of brain development and cause intellectual disability. Various genetic abnormalities are known to play a clear role in the cause of relatively infrequent but more severe types of intellectual disability. Down syndrome is the best known of the genetically linked causes of intellectual disability. In this case, there is an extra 21st chromosome. This extra chromosome alters the course of prenatal development. In addition, even after birth, extreme deprivation or lack of sensory stimulation and neglect can dramatically alter the course of brain development and lead to varying degrees of intellectual disability. Intellectual disability is also associated with a wide range of infections that can alter brain development. For example, if a pregnant woman contracts rubella, or German measles, during the first trimester, the virus can significantly slow fetal growth and lead to a number of abnormalities, including intellectual disability, hearing loss, and impaired vision. Intellectual disability is also associated with conditions that involve abnormalities in the size and shape of the head. In many of these conditions, precise causal factors are not clear. Macrocephaly is a condition in which there is an increase in the size and weight of the brain, cranial enlargement, and neurological impairment. This particular condition is known to result from an abnormal growth of a type of brain cell called glial cells. Hydrocephaly also causes an enlargement of the skull. In this relatively rare condition, there is an accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid within the brain. This accumulation causes an increase in pressure on the brain and leads to cell loss. The disorder can arise during prenatal development, infancy, or childhood. Late onset cases can be treated by inserting a shunt so that the fluid can be drained from the brain, thus preventing subsequent damage. The last cranial condition to be discussed here is microcephaly. In this condition, intellectual disability results from impaired brain development and a failure of the head to attain normal size. Children with microcephaly fall within the moderate, severe, and profound range of intellectual disability, and most show little language development. Microcephaly can result from a broad range of pathologies. The specific learning disorders include difficulties in learning and using academic skills, such as reading, writing, and mathematics. As the name implies, the disorder is restricted to one's ability to perceive or process information accurately or efficiently. The learning disorder first appears or becomes apparent during the early years of school and may be present in an individual considered to be academically gifted. For example, a child may exhibit extraordinary reading skills compared to other children of the same age, but exhibit considerable difficulty performing simple mathematical operations such as addition or subtraction. This slide illustrates the three major types of learning disorders. The cause of specific learning disorders are not well understood, and very likely include a complex interaction of genetic, epigenetic, and environmental factors that combine to influence the way in which the brain gathers and processes information. A number of key features characterize the specific learning disorders. First, there is a persistent difficulty in learning core academic skills such as reading, writing, and arithmetic calculation. Second, the person's performance of academic skills is below average compared to others in the same age group. And third, the learning difficulties are very apparent in the early school years, though some may not become apparent until later on when the demands of school increase. And lastly, the problems in learning are specific in that they are not related to intellectual ability or global developmental delays. DSM-5 recognizes four major types of communication disorder, in addition to an unspecified type. Language disorder involves difficulties in the acquisition and use of language because of problems in understanding or producing vocabulary and constructing sentences. These problems are evident in spoken, written, and sign language, and include difficulties both in the production and in the understanding of language. Speech sound disorders refers to persistent problems in articulating the sounds of speech. Recall that each letter and combination of letters requires the use of different patterns of airflow and movements of the lips, tongue, or jaw necessary to produce different speech sounds. For example, the sound for letter B is B, as in ball, taboo, or rub, and this requires a different pattern of airflow and movements than does the letter Z, or Z, as in zipper, buzzer, or nose. Child-onset fluency disorder is more commonly known as stuttering and involves difficulty with the fluency and time patterning of speech. Lastly, social communication disorder is characterized by deficits in the use of basic social communication skills, such as appropriate greetings, the ability to change communication to match a specific context or situation, or taking turns in a conversation. One of the most controversial changes in the DSM-5 has been the decision to combine autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, childhood disintegrative disorder, and pervasive disorder, developmental disorder not otherwise specified into a single spectrum diagnosis. The supposed logic behind this decision was insufficient research to indicate that these were separate disorders. So at present, rather than diagnosing separate disorders, a single spectrum disorder is diagnosed, and the severity is specified depending upon the degree of support required by the individual. The key features of autism spectrum disorder are a chronic inability to engage in reciprocal social communication and interactions, and highly restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviors or activities. Problems with social communication and interaction manifest as a difficulty with normal back and forth conversations or even initiating social interaction. There may also be poor eye contact, difficulty using facial expressions and body language as a means of communication, difficulty understanding the social communication of others, and difficulty developing age-appropriate relationships. There are a number of early warning signs. The exact cause of ASD is unknown, but genetics have been strongly implicated. Concordance rates for autism are much higher in monozygotic than dizygotic twins. However, because the monozygotic concordance rate is less than 100%, and the degree of impairment and range of symptoms vary tremendously among concordant pairs, environmental factors are most likely etiologically significant as well. Researchers have implicated abnormalities on chromosomes 13, 15, 16, or 17 in some cases of ASD. In addition, recent research has discovered a remarkable copy variation involving chromosome 7. An extra copy of a particular segment of this chromosome greatly increases the risk of autism, while the loss of that same segment results in Williams syndrome, a disorder characterized by intense sociability. Genetic abnormalities may lead to growth dysregulation of the brain. Both post-mortem and imaging studies have shown abnormalities in a number of major brain structures, including the cerebellum, cerebral cortex, limbic system, basal ganglia, and brainstem. Recent fMRI studies of ASD language disorder reveal differences in brain activation during a simple language task. Autistic participants showed less activation in the left inferior frontal gyrus than did normal participants, and greater activation in the left posterior superior temporal gyrus. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is thought to affect 3 to 9% of school-aged children. The diagnosis is made more frequently in males and in children living in poverty. The disorder is characterized by either attentional problems and/or hyperactivity that interfere with task-oriented behavior. In DSM, there are 3 specifiers for the disorder. One is the predominantly hyperactive type and is characterized by increased motor behaviors, such as an inability to sit still, impulsive behavior, short attention span, and problems with self-control. The second variation is characterized by difficulty maintaining attention and completing tasks, Such children are easily distracted but tend to have fewer conduct problems than children who are mostly hyperactive. The last specifier is a combination of both hyperactivity and inattention. Children with ADHD often experience significant problems in school, in social situations, and at home because of their overactivity and their difficulty following rules. Interestingly, there is wide variation in the prevalence of this disorder across the United States. For example, we see very, very high rates of disorder in the in the eastern portion of the United States, and comparatively lower rates in the western portion of the United States.